There's this really striking visual in the material we're looking at today that absolutely stopped me in my tracks. I really want to paint a picture of it for you.
Oh, the artwork. Yeah, it's intense.
It really is. It's a portrait of a woman, right? And
Yeah.
she's got this vibrant, wildly colorful hair, and she has these vivid, almost neon rainbow tears streaming down her face.
Right.
But the detail that really hits you is written right across her forehead in these stark black letters. It just says, "I'm fine."
And then filling the dark, chaotic background behind her is just this endless, suffocating repetition of the words BLA, BLA.
Endless.
It's an incredibly potent metaphor. You know, you look at that image and you immediately feel the crushing weight of it. I mean, it perfectly captures the silent, invisible suffering happening just beneath the surface of everyday life.
Yeah, putting on a brave face while everything is falling apart.
Exactly. It's humanity's desperate attempt to make sense of internal torment while, projecting the I'm fine to the rest of the world.
And that profound disconnect, like the war between what's happening inside our heads versus what we project outward, is exactly the entry point for what we are doing today. So welcome to this custom tailored deep dive designed specifically for you.
We have a lot of ground to cover.
We really do. We are looking at a massive synthesis of the human mind and spirit today. We're going to walk through deeply personal memoirs of spiritual torment, theological frameworks from global religions, and clinical psychology maps straight from the DSM-5.
Right.
The mission here is to explore the intersection of spiritual warfare, psychological trauma, and human resilience. Like, how do we as a species try to understand the unseen forces that just tear our lives apart?
And we should clarify, we are approaching this completely neutrally.
Totally.
We're looking at it strictly through the lens of human experience and survival. I mean, whether these unseen forces are literal spiritual entities or, the manifestations of profound psychological trauma, the suffering is incredibly real.
Very real.
The mechanisms people use to survive that suffering are what we really want to untangle today.
To really grasp the stakes here, I mean, we have to look at the sheer scale of the pain. Globally, 264 million people suffer from depression.
It's a staggering number.
It's massive.
Yeah.
The text categorizes it as a silent crisis. And what's truly heartbreaking is that individuals who perceive their suffering as a form of spiritual possession, they often hide in complete isolation.
Yeah, they won't talk about it.
Exactly. They are terrified of being met with cynicism or, getting locked in a psychiatric ward.
Well, they're afraid of being dismissed, right? They don't want a profoundly terrifying, very real lived experience reduced to cold clinical jargon.
Right, like, here's a pill.
Exactly. When you feel like you are literally fighting a monster, a prescription pad doesn't always feel like an acknowledgement of the battle you're in.
That makes total sense. And we have two incredibly vivid personal memoirs today that really ground this entire discussion. The first is what we'll call Christina's journey.
Right, Chris.
Yeah. So Christina discovers she possesses these heightened sensitivities, which she identifies as the 8 clear senses.
And the two she relies on most heavily, right, are discernment and clairsentience.
Yes. So discernment, that's the ability to distinguish truth from deception intuitively. And clairsentience is the physical ability to literally feel other people's energies and emotions.
Which, for Christina, this heightened sensitivity, while intense, ultimately becomes a tool for empowerment.
It does. She learns to manage it. She uses clairvoyant healing, actually visualizing, channeling golden light to help those around her.
Yeah.
I mean, she even describes entering these profound meditative states where she's seen portals to both heaven and hell.
Wow.
Yeah. But then we look at the second memoir in our sources, and the contrast is just harrowing.
It really is.
It's a 12-year account from an author who believes they were actively tormented by a demon named Asmodeus.
And, Asmodeus isn't just a generic boogeyman. In theological history, he has a very specific pedigree. He originates heavily in the biblical book of Tobit. In that ancient text, he is the demon who repeatedly kills the 7 husbands of a woman named Sarah.
Wait, on their wedding nights, right?
Yes, right on their wedding nights. He is essentially the ultimate demon of discord. His entire function is the destruction of intimacy and relationships.
Which maps perfectly onto the author's lived experience in this memoir. The author describes Asmodeus deliberately severing their friendships one by one.
Just tearing them down.
Exactly. They talk about a close friend named Ashley, where a sudden, invisible tension just eroded their trust until they literally couldn't speak to each other anymore. Then another friend, Matt, where the connection faded like a light switch being flipped off.
Yeah.
And most tragically, their best friend Terry, who was the only one supporting them through this horrific feeling of possession, tragically died of cancer.
So they were completely alone.
Completely. The author was left feeling like the single most hated person on earth. They eventually found their only solace in the scripture. Philippians 4.13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me.
The profound isolation in that account is what really stands out to me. I mean, you have someone completely cut off from their support network, battling an invisible enemy.
Right, and reading these accounts, the best analogy I can think of is imagine you are suddenly able to tune into a radio frequency blaring at maximum volume, but absolutely no one else in the room can hear it.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Whether it's Christina's intense clairsentience picking up everyone's emotional baggage, or this author's terrifying demonic torment, that discrepancy between what you are experiencing and what the rest of the world sees would make you feel like you were losing your mind.
That radio analogy really highlights why people caught in these situations look for a structured way to understand the noise. And that brings us into how deliverance ministries and theological frameworks actually map out this torment.
Right, they have a whole system.
They do. They don't view spiritual warfare as just random, chaotic evil. They view it as a highly structured, systematic invasion.
The architecture of oppression. But what strikes me about the deliverance model is how rigid it is. It's not just a ghost floating through a wall in the middle of the night. They describe a literal architecture to it, almost like an invasion in stages.
It's highly systematized. They track it in 4 distinct phases. So starting with infestation.
Okay.
This isn't spinning heads and pea soup right away. It starts with subtle whispers in the mind. The entity acts as a seductive guide, offering what is described as cruel mentorship.
Cruel mentorship. Wow. Kind of like a toxic partner who isolates you from your friends by convincing you that they are the only one who truly understands you.
Exactly, which seamlessly leads into stage 2, psychological gaslighting.
Okay, so twisting reality.
Right. The entity utilizes the person's existing emotional wounding and trauma to twist their reality. It leverages their deepest insecurities against them.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. Then comes stage 3, the physical and sensory toll. This is where the internal battle manifests in the body. You see reports of phantom touches, foul odors like sulfur that no one else can smell, and uncontrollable physical fits.
And then the final stage.
Stage 4 is total bondage or possession, defined by a complete loss of bodily agency. The person is basically trapped inside their own physical form.
God, that's terrifying. But the theology is very specific that these entities can't just walk in and set up shop arbitrarily.
No, they can't.
There's this concept of the architecture of open doors. They literally need legal spiritual rights
Yeah.
to enter a person, which blew my mind, honestly.
The legal framework.
Yeah, because we tend to think of the demonic realm as pure anarchy, but this sounds like a demonic legal system. They need a breach of contract to get in.
It absolutely is a legalistic framework. And those open doors are created by specific vulnerabilities.
Like what?
It could be generational curses passed down family lines, severe trauma and abuse that shatters a person's psychological defenses, deep-seated unforgiveness, or, deliberate occult involvement. The entity needs a tear in the fabric of the soul to gain entry.
Their view on addiction under this legal framework is fascinating too. They call it the Pinocchio mechanism.
Yes, this is a really unique perspective.
Because deliverance ministries don't view addiction primarily as a genetic predisposition or a purely chemical dependency.
Right.
They view it as an active, malevolent spirit that literally feeds on the addictive behavior.
Right.
So every time the person takes a drink or engages in the addiction, the demon grows stronger, just like Pinocchio's nose growing with every lie.
And you can see why that framework is psychologically appealing for someone struggling, right?
For sure.
It externalizes the blame. It separates the core identity of the sufferer from the destructive behavior. And you see this need to categorize and structure the darkness globally.
What do you mean?
Well, what's fascinating here is in Islamic theology, for instance, they actively separate shayatin, which are devils that attack psychologically by whispering temptations into the mind, from jinn.
Well, the jinn are different.
Yeah, jinn are beings of smokeless fire that are viewed as having the capability to achieve actual physical possession. It's an ancient attempt to map the difference between intrusive destructive thoughts and severe bodily dissociation. Same with Judaism's Dybbuk or Buddhism's Mara.
But here's where the theology hits a massive wall with modern medicine. If you take that exact progression we just talked about, The voices, the physical spasms, the loss of bodily control, and you walk it into a modern psychiatric ward, doctors aren't seeing demons.
No, they definitely aren't.
They are seeing very specific, documented neurological and psychological phenomena.
Right. We have to look at the clinical translation. How does the DSM-5, the Standard Psychiatric Diagnostic Manual, interpret the classic signs of demonic possession laid out in, say, the Roman Catholic ritual?
Let's walk through it because the parallels are wild.
Let's do it.
Okay, spiritual sign number 1, superhuman strength and physical contortion.
The clinical diagnosis translates that to adrenaline surges in acute psychosis or catatonic schizophrenia.
Which makes sense.
Yeah, the human body is capable of terrifying feats of strength when the nervous system is pushed to its absolute breaking point, and the brain's natural limiters are disabled by a psychotic break.
Okay, then you have xenoglossy,
Yeah.
which is the ability to speak in an unknown language.
Yeah.
Historically, a massive red flag for possession.
Huge red flag. But the clinical translation identifies this as schizophrenic word salad, Tourette's vocal tics, or this really fascinating phenomenon called cryptomnesia.
Wait, cryptomnesia, what is that?
Cryptomnesia is incredible. It's basically a memory retrieval error. A person might have accidentally heard fragments of Latin or Aramaic on a television program, or maybe they just walked past a conversation years ago.
And they just remember it.
The brain stores it, forgets the context of learning it, and then later during a highly dissociative state presents it as a new, spontaneous creation. It feels supernatural, but it's essentially a neurological misfire.
Wow. Okay, and then there's the distinct aggressive entity taking control of the body. Clinically, I'm assuming that translates directly to dissociative identity disorder, or did.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Did.
But the translation that really got me was the issue of hidden knowledge. In exorcism lore, the demon frequently reveals the hidden, secret sins of the exorcist in the room to break their confidence.
Right, the classic movie trope.
Yes. So how does modern psychology explain a patient knowing a priest's darkest secrets?
They explain it through the lens of hypovigilance. When someone has survived severe prolonged abuse, which is unfortunately very common in these extreme dissociative cases, their nervous system becomes incredibly adept at reading microexpressions.
Like body language.
Body language, subtle vocal cues, all to predict danger. It's a survival mechanism. So when a traumatized patient is in a room with an authority figure, they can cold read the insecurities, guilt, or fear of that person with astonishing, almost terrifying accuracy.
Oh, wow.
They aren't reading the person's soul, they are reading their nervous system.
Which brings us to the core overlap between these two completely different worlds.
Yeah.
The trauma dissociation link. Both deliverance ministries and modern psychiatry agree on the fundamental trigger for these extreme states.
Yes.
It is almost always severe trauma.
The difference is entirely in the interpretation of the mechanics. I mean, the medical view sees a psychological defense mechanism. The mind is subjected to unspeakable abuse, so it shatters. It fragments to protect the core self.
Right.
And sometimes one of those psychological fragments takes on the identity of a demon. Why? Because that's the cultural vocabulary the patient has for ultimate evil.
That makes total sense.
But the theological view looks at that exact same trauma and says those psychological fractures are the open doors we discussed earlier. The trauma breached the soul's armor, giving a literal demonic entity the legal right to enter.
And just to complicate things further, there are sociological and biological models to explain this too in the sources. Have you ever heard of the anthropological deprivation model?
Yes, developed by I.M. Lewis. It's a fascinating sociological lens.
He studied possession cults globally and proposed that spirit possession often acts as a subconscious sociological tool for marginalized groups. Like, think about women in highly patriarchal, oppressive societies where they are afforded zero voice or authority.
Right.
Suddenly, the woman becomes possessed by a malevolent, often male, spirit. She starts making demands.
And because the community genuinely believes in the spirit, they can't punish her. They have to listen to the spirit and give it what it wants to make it leave.
Exactly.
It's a culturally sanctioned mechanism to gain power and get your needs met when you have absolutely no other recourse. The woman isn't faking it. Her subconscious creates the possession to survive the systemic oppression.
Then you throw in the physical deficit hypothesis. Anthropologists actually mapped the geographical prevalence of possession outbreaks against regional diets.
Diet.
Yes. They found a biological correlation. Severe deficiencies in thiamine, calcium, and vitamin D, which are heavily exacerbated by extreme poverty, cause severe nervous system malfunctions. This triggers involuntary spasms, erratic behavior, and hysteria. But the surrounding culture institutionalizes those biological misfires as spirit possession.
So we basically synthesize all this through what we can call the prism of possession.
I like that.
Whether it is a literal spiritual root exploiting a moral breach, a psychological fracture protecting a shattered mind, a sociological rebellion against systemic oppression, or, a calcium deficiency.
Right.
At its core, the phenomenon of possession is a profound human cry for intervention. It is what happens when internal control is entirely lost and the community has to step in. And again, we aren't taking a side on which framework is correct, but rather exploring how humanity defines this trauma.
That brings up a really interesting pivot. We've talked about how individuals deal with this internal loss of control. But what happens when society at large experiences a loss of control? Because we don't just blame demons for individual suffering. Humanity has a long history of using the demonic as a cultural scapegoat.
Oh, absolutely. You're talking about the intersection of moral panics and pop culture. It's one of the most predictable societal behaviors we have.
It really is. Let's look at what the text calls the devil's playlist.
Yeah.
Music has always been a primary target for this. Going back to the Middle Ages, there's this concept of the tritone in music theory.
Right, the augmented fourth.
Yeah. Medieval musicians actively avoided playing it because the dissonance was so unsettling. They literally called it diabolus in musica, the devil in music.
Well, the human brain thrives on pattern and resolution. When a sound is naturally unresolved and creates acoustic tension, our ancestors didn't just find it unpleasant, they assigned a moral value to it.
Dissonance equals evil.
Exact.
And that instinct never really went away. You see it in the famous Crossroads Covenant myth, the legend that blues pioneer Robert Johnson traded his soul to a dark man at a midnight crossroad in exchange for absolute musical mastery.
Classic story.
But it really kicks into high gear with the modern satanic panic cycles.
And these cycles are so revealing because they map perfectly onto distinct cultural anxieties. Like in the 1950s and 60s, the panic was rock and roll.
Elvis shaking his hips.
Right. The establishment's accusation wasn't just that the music was loud, it was framed as a reversion to savagery and explicitly linked to fears of communist subversion and racial integration.
Then we hit the 1980s, the era of heavy metal. Parents were terrified. This is when the PMRC, the Parents Music Resource Center, was formed by political wives in Washington.
Oh, the Filthy 15.
Yes, they published the Filthy 15, a list of songs by artists like Prince and Black Sabbath, demanding they be censored. Why? Because they believed the music was actively promoting the occult, deviant sex, and violence to their kids.
And then in the 1990s, the panic shifted to Norwegian black metal. But there, the accusations escalated from just corrupting youth to literal satanic terrorism.
Yeah, that got really dark.
It involved actual church arsons and murders within the scene.
But this cultural branding isn't just parents being worried. It has real, devastating legal consequences. Music gets used as a legal scapegoat in actual courtrooms. The most glaring example in our sources is the wrongful conviction of the West Memphis Three in the early 90s. 3 teenagers were essentially put on trial for listening to Metallica, wearing black clothing, and reading Stephen King novels.
Because the prosecution couldn't find physical evidence tying them to the horrific murders of 3 young boys, so they used the teenagers' cultural tastes as evidence of a satanic motive.
Which is insane.
They convinced a jury that heavy metal music turned these kids into occult killers. They spent almost 2 decades in prison before being released.
But hold on, here's where it gets really interesting. If we look at that, isn't labeling secular music or teenage subcultures demonic just a massive societal displacement tactic?
How do you mean?
I mean, it feels like an incredibly convenient way for society to project its anxieties onto teenagers with electric guitars, rather than doing the hard, painful work of dealing with the actual complex root causes of violence or systemic poverty or mental health crises.
Oh, it is the ultimate societal easy out. If the problem is a complex matrix of socioeconomic disparity, failing schools, and untreated trauma, that is incredibly difficult and expensive to solve.
Right.
It requires holding a mirror up to the community. But if the problem is a heavy metal cassette tape possessed by a demon, well, you can just smash the tape. You can ban the song. It provides a tangible, simple enemy to fight when the real societal issues feel insurmountable.
Wow. It's the I'm Fine girl from the artwork again, but on a macro level. Society slapping an I'm Fine sticker over complex rot by just blaming the devil.
That's a great connection.
So as we bring all these threads together, whether a person is dealing with clinical trauma, surviving a societal moral panic, or fighting literal spiritual warfare, how does someone actually achieve freedom? What is the ascent out of this abyss according to the sources?
Well, the historical and modern texts draw a very sharp distinction between how the secular and spiritual worlds view the healing process. They use a great gardening metaphor.
Okay.
They argue that secular treatment, like medication or behavioral coping mechanisms, is like cutting the weed at the ground. It manages the visible behavior, but it leaves the spiritual stronghold, the root, intact.
And that sets the stage for a relapse.
Exactly. Deliverance ministry, however, focuses on pulling the root by addressing and driving out the entity itself.
But it's not presented as a magic bullet. Deliverance has strict rules, too. There's this concept called the law of the empty house.
Right, from Matthew 12.43.
Yes, the warning is that if a soul is swept clean of an entity but left completely empty, the demon will roam around, find nothing, and return to the person with 7 more wicked spirits.
Which is a very practical psychological warning about creating a vacuum. The texts note it can take up to 6 weeks to see the full fruit of a deliverance session. Yeah, and if you think about it from a psychological standpoint, that timeline mirrors the severe physical and emotional withdrawals of chemical addiction. When you remove a massive coping mechanism, even a destructive one like an addiction or a dissociative persona, you leave a massive void in the person's life.
So you have to fill it.
That void must be immediately filled with something positive, like rigorous discipleship, community support, or the Holy Spirit in the theological context. Otherwise, the person will just revert to the familiar darkness.
And the
Must be
practical
filled with
coping
the Holy
strategies
Spirit.
offered for surviving this process are surprisingly trauma-informed. One that really stood out is childlike regression for safety.
Oh, the comfort items.
Yeah, it advises using comfort blankets, stuffed animals, or childhood items to help regulate the nervous system during moments of sheer terror.
Because grounding the physical body is essential when the mind feels under attack. When a patient is hyper-aroused or dissociating, tactile sensations like the weight of a blanket force the brain to recognize the physical present rather than the internal nightmare.
Which brings us full circle to Christina's memoir. How did she maintain her boundaries and achieve her freedom?
She had specific methods.
She did. She learned to utilize her prophetic dreams. She specifically talks about navigating complex labyrinths in her dreams, which is a classic psychological symbol for working through trauma.
I got free through committing my life to Christ, surrendering my life, being filled with the Holy Spirit, spending time with God twice a day, and reading the Word every day, twice a day, and staying away from worldly things and sin. Anyways, back to this.
She relied on her spirit guides, and she practiced reading signs in her daily life.
Like the butterflies.
Right, seeing butterflies as symbols of necessary transformation.
Though it's vital to note, the material heavily emphasizes discernment for practitioners like Christina.
Yes, her biggest tool.
They warn that anyone engaging with the unseen must rigorously discern between deceased loved ones acting as guides, purpose-built non-human entities, and demonic forces that are simply mimicking benevolent guides to cause deception.
Her gift of discernment was her ultimate shield. So if we pull all these disparate threads together, from the psychiatric clinics to the deliverance churches to the criminal courts, what is the ultimate takeaway? What is everyone really fighting for here?
The universal quest across all these frameworks is autonomy. Whether an individual is going through a religious exorcism to cast out a demon, or undergoing intensive trauma therapy to help the brain reprocess trapped memories, or a marginalized group is engaging in a culturally sanctioned trance, the end goal is exactly the same.
Reclaiming themselves.
It is the ultimate reclamation of identity. It is moving from being defined by a word curse, where someone internalizes the malicious, destructive things spoken over them, or an addiction or a severe trauma, and reclaiming ownership of your own body and mind. It's moving from the descent of oppression back to the ascent of being a resilient survivor.
It's taking back the house.
Exactly.
Well, thank you for joining us for this incredibly intense exploration of the abyss today. We've woven a complex, sometimes contradictory, but ultimately beautiful tapestry of how humanity survives its darkest torments.
It's a testament to human endurance, really, the lengths we will go to in order to survive our own minds.
It really is.
Yeah.
And I want to leave you with one final mind-expanding fact to mull over long after we're done here. A landmark study of 400 different societies found that a staggering 74% of cultures globally hold a formalized belief in spirit possession.
74%.
74%.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you, Could this universal human paradigm suggest that whether we label it a neurobiological misfire in the brain, a trauma-induced dissociation of the mind, or a literal demonic entity from the abyss, the human
It's a literal demonic entity from the abyss. That is what it is. But let's continue listening.
mind simply requires a tangible, personified vocabulary to wage war against its deepest, most terrifying shadows. Maybe sometimes to finally wipe away the words, "I'm fine," and actually deal with the pain underneath. We have to give the darkness a name before we can cast it out.